I've got a question. Does this sound like film music? Okay, maybe not Hans Zimmer, but possibly something from a film of the, say, 1950s or 60s. Maybe with Audrey Hepburn?
This is an instrumental arrangement of Edith Piaf and Louis Guille's La Vie en Rose, which Audrey Hepburn does sing in the 1954 film Sabrina. But what we're hearing is Michel Legrand's arrangement of the melody for his best-selling easy listening album, I Love Paris, released the very same year. You might remember Legrand from episode 3. He composed the music for The Umbrellas of Cherbourg. But if Legrand enjoyed a successful career in film, he absolutely thrived in the genre of easy listening. Hi, I'm Cecilia Krista, and I've just finished my master's in communication studies here at the University of Iowa.
And I'm Nathan Platt. I teach music and film history at Iowa. Welcome back to Sounding Cinema.
While the last few decades have seen more attention paid to film music, the same cannot be said for easy listening music, a genre characterized by its pleasant, soothing quality and intended function as background to daily life. In his 2021 book, Easy Listening and Film Scoring, 1948 to 1978, Jack Curtis Dubowsky shows how these important commercial musical art forms have more in common than we might think. He details the ways in which many film score composers, including Henry Mancini and Michel Legrand, were also prolific easy-listening artists.
Stylistically eclectic, easy listening drew from jazz, exotica, and even the Baroque revival, affecting the sounds of film in the process. His account also restores the role of musicians of color, including Charlie Parker and Quincy Jones, whose contributions to the genre have been downplayed. Although easy listening's heyday ended in the 70s, Dubowsky shows that its audience and habits live on through new age music and Spotify playlists tailored to leisure or work activities.
Jack Curtis Dubowsky wears many hats. He's a composer, author, and filmmaker. He's an active performer too. Recently, his Jack Curtis Dubowsky Ensemble provided live musical accompaniment to the 1927 silent film classic, Sunrise. And Jack is currently at work on a book about composing for silent films, so stay tuned for that.
Oh, I like it. That makes me sound really legit.
Jack's first book, Intersecting Film, Music, and Queerness, came out in 2016, and his most recent book, which we're discussing here, is called Easy Listening and Film Scoring, 1948 to 1978. Jack, thank you so much for joining us on Sounding Cinema.
Oh, thanks for having me.
It's really good to have you here. So let's start at the beginning. How did you come to find this topic?
As best as I remember it, it was two things. One was when I was working on my first book, Intersecting Film, Music, and Queerness, when I was writing, I would want to have music playing, and I couldn't write if there were lyrics and people singing and saying stuff. So I began listening to a lot of instrumental music and a lot of easy listening. And a lot of this came through this sort of lounge revival thing that happened in the 1990s when I was making music and I had an early Pro Tools system, and it was very fashionable in clubs to have this kind of cocktail revival music. And so we were doing like early sampling, and you'd make loops out of grooves from easy listening records and things like that. And so that was kind of like one entree into the genre. So when I was, buying records to listen to while I was writing the first book and buying instrumental records, I started buying these mid-century easy listening records. And another entree for me was I had discovered by accident the Hollyridge Strings Beatles records. I just bought it. I saw it in a record store, this old beat up record, and it was like orchestral versions of the Beatles. And I'm like, what is this? I have to buy this. And I started collecting all of these records. And I would even buy them if I already had them because they were so great and so precious. I have multiple copies of these things. The other thing that happened was that there was a conference that was a film music conference whose theme was orchestration. And I did a paper on the similarities in mid-century orchestration between film music and easy listening. And that was part of the journey, was looking at the orchestration and how the orchestration for easy listening and the orchestration for music for film was very similar. And the other thing was that I think in the course of researching that conference paper, I came across this article by Keir Keightley, who's this Canadian musicologist who did a lot of the heavy lifting that started me off in this book in a paper that he published, a very lengthy paper about easy listening. So Keir Keightley has this 2008 paper called Music for Middlebrows, Defining the Easy Listening Era, which is published in American Music. And this journal article really laid a lot of the groundwork for my conference paper and for this book. And it also kind of let me know that there was something of scholarly interest here. It's funny because I met Keir and I asked him to write this book. I'm like, you got to do a book about this. This should be a whole book. And Keir was like, no, I'm not doing a whole book on it. And I told him that, that I was going to, do a proposal for the book, and he gave me his blessing, which was really important to me because I felt like in some sense, I was just kind of taking what he was doing and building on it. So I thought it was really important to give him credit for it and to point to this amazing article that he wrote.
And what about easy listening for people who are just coming to this? What is easy listening? I realize that's not a simple question.
Right. So, I think one of the things that I learned or try to argue is that easy listening, and I'm doing little finger air quotes here, is a popular term for a mid-century phenomenon that is a little bit of an artificial construct. Because in fact, music for leisure, music for relaxation, and music for productivity are things that have existed for hundreds of years and still exist. But in the sense of popular culture and cultural studies and the popular imagination, you have all these people that look at quote unquote easy listening as this mid-century phenomenon that's tied in with post-war mass consumer culture and the post-war economic boom and the boom in technology, of which the LP record is one. But if you look at it from a broad perspective, it becomes very difficult to tie these boundary lines around what is quote unquote easy listening. So the book looks at this period from 1948 to 1978. And in the book, I give my particular reasons for why it's 1948 to 1978. But at the same time, I try to point to its predecessors going back hundreds of years and what's going on today within the same genres.
Yeah. I was so glad that you talked about this because this had actually just come up. Cecilia and I had spoken about this earlier, and it came up in one of the classes that I was teaching where we were looking at New Age music, which you also talk about as in some ways kind of a descendant of easy listening, and how it seemed like so many of the musical qualities of music from the 80s and 90s designed again for reflection, sipping tea and looking out the window, meditating, has a lot of carryover to the music that now people, queue up on YouTube to study to for, hours on end. They're not exactly the same, but in terms of this kind of music that's sort of percolating in the background and is creating an ambiance, but not necessarily demanding too much of your attention. It's, well, you just said it. This has a long history, and it's still very much with us.
And so, I think that's one of the things I was trying to do. I think I was also really fascinated by, and never really came up with a good answer for, some of the paradoxes in easy listening, because you have this paradox between music for leisure and music for work. So music for leisure is you're supposed to relax and chill out, and music for work has this huge tradition as well, and it's supposed to be about productivity and getting stuff done, which are two radically opposite sides of the spectrum: work and relaxation, work and leisure. And yet the material that's created for both is often remarkably similar.
To follow up on the idea of this paradox that you bring up, which is the paradox of music for work and music for leisure. And sometimes the sounds are even the same. It's just the marketing in many cases, which kind of shunts them into categories. So can you speak a little bit more to that paradox?
Yeah, there's this other paradox with so-called easy listening, which is the whole idea of function. And a lot of people say, oh, this music has no function, it has no purpose. But in fact, it's the most highly functional, most purposeful music you can think of, because it's meant to facilitate relaxation and leisure, or it's meant deliberately to increase productivity. So you have this paradox of, is this music functional or is it not functional? Is music that's functional good? Is music that's functional, is it bad? Why do you have this valuation placed on function in music? Does art need to have a function? It's really interesting. It brings in all these other issues of why this music is disliked or derided or enjoyed or not enjoyed. Well, the whole thing is nuts, because I had written the first draft of the book. And as academics know, you write your book, you turn it into the press, and they send it out to usually 2 reviewers. And I got this incredible note. Usually people complain about the reviews they get, but I got this incredible note, which was, Dubowsky should look at music while you work. I'm like, okay, I'm going to look this up. So it turns out that prior to the United States entry into World War II, in, I believe, 1939 or 1940, the BBC starts this radio program called Music While You Work. The intention of this radio program was to improve productivity in munitions factories. So basically, you have these factories that are making bombs for war, and they're trying to figure out, how can we get people to work harder and faster and make more bombs? And they try this experiment with music, because, there's already this tradition of slave songs and sailor shanties. There's already this ancient tradition of music for work. And they're thinking, let's put it in the factories. And this does some really interesting things. They figure out a number of things. They figure out that, number one, they want people to hum, sing along, and whistle to the music. So it has to be known popular tunes. But 2, it should be instrumental, because they don't want to hear people singing. They just want to be able to hum along or whistle along or sing along, but it should be instrumental versions. And the other interesting thing is that because the factories have a really loud noise floor, the tannoys or the speakers are really crappy. They need to have the music at a consistent volume, which is neither too loud nor too soft. If the music is too soft, you won't hear it with all the machines in the factories going. And if it's too loud, it distorts the speakers.
Welcome to debut this morning on Rhythmic Records.
And just to give you a taste of this practice, this is an excerpt from Humphrey Jennings' wartime documentary, Listen to Britain. In this segment, we see a factory floor with women singing along to an instrumental arrangement of Yes, My Darling Daughter. You can hear their voices faintly over the thrum of machines in the radio.
So they come to this solution where it's instrumental music that everyone knows of a consistent level of volume, which is basically the foundation of mid-century easy listening. So it's really interesting that mid-century easy listening comes out of radio and comes out of music for wartime munitions factories. And then it's not until really the 1950s or 1948 when you get the mono LP comes out, where you get people buying easy listening records. But Music While You Work, which was a BBC radio program that wasn't even discontinued until 1967, was playing this music. And originally it was played by live orchestra. So they didn't have recordings. The live orchestras would play this music and it would be broadcast on air and piped into these factories.
You know, one of the things that I thought was fascinating about this book, and it's a recurring theme, and at least for me, I might be totally wrong on this, but it's one thing that does kind of set easy listening of the varieties that you're talking about here a little bit different from music that has come since, is this fascination with Baroque sounds, Baroque genres, Baroque mannerisms. And I do just want to say, I just want to read this passage because it's so great, where you're talking about how attractive the music of Johann Sebastian Bach was, because you say, quote, resonated with the space age. Bach seemed like a massive, seething rocket ship with all the tiny moving parts of a Rolex. This Baroque styling felt fresh, new, and daring in the 1950s through the 70s. And then you also say that Italian Baroque music, with repetitive concerto grossi, resonated with background home entertainment and satisfied middle-brow pretensions and need for predictability and unobtrusiveness. And then you so generously give us so many examples of the way this worked into easy listening. I have some of my favorite examples, but can you just talk a little bit about that?
I think this is going to have to be 3 hours today. So cancel the class. We're just going to end up talking about Baroque music and easy listening. Yeah, that was all great to research and learn about. It was very exciting. And historically, a lot of this dates to 1950, which was the Bach bicentennial 200-year anniversary of Bach's death in 1750. And of course, record labels, everyone wanted to capitalize on this. So there was all these Bach festivals and concerts and albums that were coming out. And this directly influenced all this other stuff, including all these harpsichord records that came out, Wanda Lewandowska, and the Swingle Singers, and which came out in 1962. But I mean, it's gradually happening slowly and steadily, and you can pinpoint it to 1950. I will say that a lot of the Baroque period music was meant for enjoyment, or was meant to be, for the court, or was meant for people to dance to, or to work to, or to relax to. And so for functionality, there are a lot of similarities.
Another thing I loved in that I literally screenshotted this part of what you wrote, which was the idea that King Louis XIV had Les Petits Violons, and they played for him at dinner and as he went to bed, which is so funny to imagine. His group kind of following you while you're kind of opening the blanket. Yeah, so that's very funny to me.
Well, I was thinking we could sort of pivot the discussion over to, the other part of your book being film, and particularly the relationship between easy listening and film scoring, and the many musicians who worked in both of these fields and oftentimes other fields in addition. I thought it's one of the really fun parts of reading this is just how many household names come up in this. You mention people like Quincy Jones and Andre Previn, who, are known as film composers. They're known as conductors and band leaders and jazz pianists and orchestral conductors. But for your kind of major case studies, you talk about Henry Mancini, maybe best known for Breakfast at Tiffany's. And Michel Legrand, whom we've talked about a little bit on this podcast when we talked about his music for Umbrellas of Cherbourg. And so I was just wondering, can you tell us a little bit about how you decided to pick these musicians out of all of the ones you looked at, and what are some of the, stories or lessons that their careers and their music offer?
When I initially did the book proposal, I think an early version of the book proposal, I had imagined the book as being in two parts, one, a kind of basic information, and then the second part being profiles of 6 to 10 composers and focusing on these 6 to 10 composers and their work, how it overlapped both easy listening and film scoring. And of course, what happened is that it turned out that these other portions of the book were far more important about, looking at race and easy listening, and looking at, work music and easy listening, and looking at the history and easy listening, and looking at subgenres and easy listening. And that part exploded, and all the other composers got pushed out except for Mancini and Michel Legrand, who still have their own chapters in the book. Initially, there was going to be a chapter on Stu Phillips. There was going to be a chapter on Lee Holdridge. There was going to be a chapter on Quincy Jones. There was going to be a chapter on Patrick Williams. There was going to be a chapter on Angela Morley. And it just turned out that the book would have been like 500,000 words. So it kind of felt that this Quincy Jones stuff was really helpful and did well in the chapter on race and easy listening. A lot of the Lee Holdridge and Stu Phillips stuff, instead of being their own chapter, got sprinkled throughout the book. And Mancini and Legrand ended up still having their own chapters because those two composers best exemplify the situation of the mid-century composer who worked in easy listening, television, film scoring, and how this tied in with popular culture and commercial culture and the business culture of the day.
Thank you. Those are the things that are just always bouncing around in my head. So thanks for speaking to that. So I wanted to draw your attention to the instructional manuals that you often discuss in your book. These instructional manuals for easy listening records. And I thought these were so fascinating. I'd love to take a look at these. And I'm interested in what was the most interesting, surprising, or entertaining thing you found among those manuals.
Yeah, I couldn't entirely figure these out. I think that what the deal was that they were trying to get more and more people into collecting records, and perhaps some people were intimidated by this new thing. Like maybe it's like, to draw a false equivalency, something like NFTs. It's like everyone, oh, should I buy an NFT? I don't know how to buy an NFT. I have to have a wallet. Oh, I better learn how to have a wallet, And I'm not advocating the use of NFTs or wallets. I'm just trying to draw this parallel of why there's a 200-page book about how to listen to records. How do you listen to a record? You put it on and you listen to it. And the funny thing is, in the 200 pages, that's what he says. He says, put on the record and listen to it and enjoy it. And that's all you have to do. I mean, it's crazy. But that's the best explanation I can think of. It was basically a marketing tool to try to get people comfortable with listening to music and feel like it was okay for them to buy records and listen to them.
Okay, so we'd like to know, as the podcast and as the nation, what was the most challenging part of writing easy listening and film music, and what brought the most joy and satisfaction?
I think that one of the challenges of writing this book, for me personally, was I had trouble finding a lot of queer people that were involved in mid-century easy listening. It was, to me, it was interesting that it turns out that there's a whole lot of people of color that were involved in easy listening, and that was pretty easy to document and discuss. Women and queer people were a lot harder to sort of find, and I think that was really, really interesting, because I'm sure that they're there, and that was a little bit painful, especially since my first book was intersecting film music and queerness, and it was hard for me to find a lot of openly or obviously queer people that had been a part of this story, and that still is a little bit of a head scratcher to me. That, I think, was the trickiest thing for me personally. What was the other question?
And what was the most joyful part?
The most joyful part? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think I enjoy writing as a process. So to me, it's a lot more interesting when you're kind of doing the work and you're getting really into it and you're learning things, and then you're trying to figure out how to write it down and present it in a way that makes sense, and the language is engaging and beautiful, and that it's interesting. Because I think that even though I write primarily nonfiction, it's still involves a certain amount of how do you relate the information, aka storytelling. How do you present this? Because a lot of this stuff is really fascinating, like the stories about the munitions factories and how people, did these records, and there's a lot of really interesting stuff there, and even stories that are a little weird, like, you mentioned Andre Previn earlier. Andre Previn dies. Everybody and their brother writes an obituary, and no one talks about the easy listening records. And you're going, that's really weird. That's what put him on the map. And so there's a lot of these things that are really interesting, and figuring out how to present these arguments and have things make sense. And I think for me, because I'm so interested in chronology, because I believe that things happen at a certain time for a certain reason, that a lot of the book is really carefully looking at chronology. I know, for example, the Michel Legrand chapter and the Henry Mancini chapters are laid out chronologically rather than thematically or something else. Because for me, chronology is always very informative.
Jack, it has been such a pleasure talking with you about your book. Thank you so much for visiting Sounding Cinema.
Thanks for having me.
And that's our episode. We want to extend a special thank you to Jack Dubowsky for spending time with us. Once again, his book, which is published by Routledge, is Easy Listening and Film Scoring, 1948 to 1978.
Jack also has a new album out called Bolsa Chica Calm. The album was inspired by his work on the book. It draws from ambient, new age, experimental music, vaporwave, and albums like Wendy Carlo's Sonic Seasonings. You can find it on Bandcamp and Spotify. Lastly, if you're looking for some easy listening and film recommendations, Jack provided us with some great ones. Check those out in our show notes for this episode.
This episode of Sounding Cinema was written, edited, and produced by Cecilia Krizda and Nathan Platt. For more information on the podcast, visit soundingcinema.com or follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Sounding Cinema Podcast. Lastly, help others find the show by reviewing and subscribing on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. The musical excerpts heard in this episode are all from albums discussed in Jack's book. You can find links to the full tracks in our show notes. In order of appearance, we heard from Michel Legrand's arrangement of La Vie en Rose from I Love Paris, Henry Mancini's theme from Charade from the album Quincy Jones Explores the Music of Henry Mancini, Ticket to Ride performed by the Hollyridge Strings, Best of the Beatles Volume 2, Quincy Jones' theme from The Pawnbroker from Ramsey Lewis's The Movie album, the Swingle Singers' performance of Bach's Fugue in D minor and Wacht auf from the album Jazz Sebastian Bach, Henry Mancini's Moon River from Breakfast at Tiffany's, and Mancini conducting one of Legrand's best-known melodies from Umbrellas of Cherbourg. We also heard David Raxon's theme from Laura from the album Charlie Parker with Strings, and finally, Michel Legrand's Ding Ding.
And also in that vein, if there's any PhD students out here listening, this guy, Ray Martin, who did a lot of easy listening and was a mid-century composer and also did a lot of library music. There's a lot of anecdotes about Ray Martin on the internet that I could not verify and could not repeat in a proper scholarly book. But if anyone wants to look into and research Ray Martin, there's a lot of interesting stuff there. About who he was and what he did and the whole wartime mid-century, what was going on with this guy. And his whole story looks to me absolutely fascinating. And that would make a great monograph or dissertation, hint to anybody who's out there looking for a subject and is interested in mid-century easy listening or library music. Ray Martin, check him out.